Yes. Who is beginning? Yeah.
לפני שאנחנו מתחיל, אפשר לשאול שאלה אם יש את התרגום, זה נקרא ומי יש לו?
هذا المترجم من العربي. ترجم من العربي قريب.
Wonderful, guys. Really happy to see you all here. Welcome to episode 2 of The Search. The Search is a series of events that have been planned for 3 or 4 months now in order to help students think about the big questions of life, of religion, faith, purpose, as we're going to be looking at today. My name's Josh. I'm from England, and I'm part of the team who's been helping to put this together.
I'm Yvonne. I'm not from England. I'm from Nazareth, and I'm a student here.
Well, we'd love to introduce Michael.
Yes.
Thank you.
So Michael is an author and speaker. He helps students ask the questions like the one we're asking today about purpose, meaning. We want to ask him a few questions to get to know him. So first of all, where are you from?
Well, my surname, Ox, is from Estonia. That's where my father's side of the family are from, so northeastern Europe. But I was born and brought up in England, in a place called Leicester. A few years ago, when I mentioned Leicester, anyone who was into football said, "Hey, they won the league." This year, we got relegated. So not so many people like Leicester anymore.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry too.
And Michael, we know you're very experienced with coming to campuses like this. Incidentally, Michael is in this country especially to speak to students in Tel Aviv University, not really for any other purpose. So we're very lucky to have him. So how many countries have you been to altogether this week?
So the last time I checked, I think it was 76. So, having said that, though, Europe has 50 countries in, and I've been to all 50 in Europe. So actually, outside of Europe, 26, which is still quite a lot. But yeah, my wife and I have a bit of a competition because both of us have jobs that involve a lot of traveling. So obviously, I travel to speak. My wife is a pilot for British Airways, and so she has been to, I think, 80 countries. I've been to more in Europe, but that's because she flies long haul. So she's always going to like Africa, South America, so on. In fact, today, funny story, because we travel a lot, we're often kind of past each other. And we have an expression in English when you say that if 2 people miss each other a lot, they are like ships in the night. You have that expression? I don't know if you do, but like ships passing in the night. So I say the expression of our marriage should be we're like planes in the night, because today, for the first time ever, we actually passed each other in the sky. So I was flying, obviously, to Tel Aviv. My wife had been in Kuwait. She was flying back to London. And somewhere over Bosnia, our planes passed in about 2 kilometers. So my wife, who obviously has a better view from the front of the plane, took a photograph in the distance. You could see just little dots, and that was me on my plane going in the opposite direction. And so she was listening in to the radio of my aeroplane as I flew past her very fast. So that was quite cool. Although sad, because I wish she was coming the same direction with me. Yeah.
So, yeah, Now we know who you are, what's your lifestyle,
Yeah.
and we know the story. So we're going to start, and
Great.
after the talk, we're going to have questions. So if you have any, you can, write them down or memorize them so we can.
Great. Fantastic.
So over to you, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you. I always think it's a good idea if you get a round of applause at the beginning, because you never know whether you'll get one at the end. So there you go. Thank you. And Yvonne just said, we will have a time for questions at the end. And you can do that in two ways. You can do that by going to this website, sli.do. If you go to that website and then you put in this code, the search, you will find not only a place to put your questions, but also a place where you can view other people's questions. So if you can't think of a question, you can vote on other people's questions. And if you think the question is good, you can vote it up. If you think the question is bad, you can't vote it down. Okay, I'm sorry. You will have to think of a better question and hope that yours gets more votes. So we're very democratic, okay, when it comes to questions. Or the other way, it's very technologically advanced. At the end of the talk, you can put your hand up. Okay, that's also possible if you would prefer not to. But this is quite fun, and you can be on that. The other advantage is that if you find the talk very boring, then you can be on your phone, on Instagram. I will assume that you're on Slido asking questions. And as long as somebody asks a question, then we'll be okay. And we won't know who was on Slido, who was on Instagram. Okay? Now, as we've already said, this whole series of events is exploring big questions of life. And today's question is obviously a very big one. What is my purpose? And does anybody care? And as I was thinking about this topic, it reminded me of a small video that I once watched. Now, this video, I don't think the sound is working, but it doesn't matter. All you need to realize, well, I'll translate it as we go through. Here we go. So this lady is saying to her papa, she says, "Papa, what did you think of the iPad that I bought you for Christmas?" Let's see what happens. And then he says, "What?" There you go. So she was obviously hoping that her papa would find a good purpose for the iPad that she bought him for Christmas. And he has found a very interesting purpose, a brand new chopping board. How kind of his granddaughter or his daughter. But of course, that was not the purpose for which the iPad was made. And of course, that raises the question, are we created with a purpose? And if so, what is that purpose? And could it be possible to miss that purpose in life? Now, actually, I think this is one of the biggest questions we could ask. I don't know if you've come across this guy, Viktor Frankl. He was an Austrian Jew in the Second World War, and he incredibly survived the Auschwitz concentration camp. And after the war, he wrote this book called Man's Search for Meaning. It's one of the best-selling books of the 20th century, and I recommend it. And in it, he says something that I found very interesting. He said, in the concentration camp, he discovered that the people who lived the longest were not necessarily the ones who were the youngest or the fittest. He said the people who lived the longest were those who could continue to hold on to some sense of meaning and purpose in life. That seemed to have the greatest impact. And he goes on to say, this is the one thing that we cannot do without. We all need to have a sense of purpose and meaning. And if we lose that, it is very hard to keep living. In fact, he says very memorably, anyone who has a why to live for can cope with almost any what. In other words, if we have a purpose to life, then somehow we have an ability to cope with sometimes even horrific circumstances. Interestingly, I think where in the world do we seem to struggle with life the most often I've found in my travels, it's those who have materially quite a lot. Because actually what we have often in particularly Western Europe, where I come from, is a lot of material possessions, but a lack of meaning, a lack of purpose. And perhaps that's because for the last 200 years, the predominant view of life in the West has been that life basically has no meaning. If you want a story to describe the purpose of life, the story is evolution and nothing more, isn't it? We've come from nothing, we are heading to nothing. And in that kind of philosophical system, the purpose of life is ultimately nothing. Listen to what this philosopher and ethicist said, Patricia Churchland. She said, the principal job, the chore of your brains, is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. A fancier style of representing the world is advantageous as long as it enhances the organism's chances of survival. In other words, what is your purpose in life? To get your body parts in the correct position so that you reproduce. That's all that really matters. And any other purpose and meaning is only advantageous as long as it increases your chances for survival. I reckon most of us find that a quite dissatisfying view of the purpose of life. Is that really the only purpose? And it also raises interesting questions like, if I cannot reproduce for whatever reason, what's the purpose of my life then? Now, interestingly, some people have taken this view of life to its logical conclusion. Francis Bacon, the artist, came to this conclusion. He said, man is an accident, a completely futile being that has to play out the game without reason. Because that's all we are. We're an accident. We don't have any purpose. Or Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher of the mid-20th century, said, man is a crumpled piece of paper in the rain whose only liberation is death. Now, actually, I want to applaud people like that for being consistent with their worldview. Because they say, look, if we're coming from nothing and we're heading to nothing, then what is the purpose of life? Well, ultimately, nothing. Now, some people say, okay, but I don't get philosophical about it. I'll create my own meaning and purpose in life. There may not be any ultimate, overarching, objective purpose, but I'll just create my own. And that's often what people say to me when we talk about this kind of topic. And I guess there's two things that are worth saying about that. Firstly, in creating our own meaning in life, could we be missing out on a much bigger one? Think of the iPad. Was Papa happy using his iPad as a chopping board? Yes, he was, wasn't he? He had created a purpose for his iPad. The only thing was, he was only using it for a fraction of the possibility. That was created for such a bigger purpose, and he had missed it. Which makes me ask the question, could it be that actually our lives have a bigger purpose that we miss when we create our own? And the other question is this, if I create my own purpose, if I create my own meaning in life, that is contingent upon me, isn't it? And ultimately, there is one reality that we all face, which is death. And if death is the end for me and you and ultimately everything as well, what is left for our purpose, for our meaning? And imagine this. Imagine at the end of your time here at university in Tel Aviv, you discover some secret information that you don't yet know, okay? The secret information is that after your 3, 4, 5, however many years you are, depending on your course, you don't actually get a degree, okay? The university says, thank you for coming, goodbye. Disappointing, okay? Now, if you knew that was going to happen at the end of your time here in Tel Aviv, would you turn up for class tomorrow? Would you study for the exam at the end of the semester? Probably not. Because what is the point if ultimately there's nothing to show for it? And if that is the case with life, if ultimately there is nothing to show for it, What are we to make of our little purposes that we create for ourselves? Which is interesting, because that makes me think that perhaps this is one of the reasons why people turn to, if not religion, spirituality for answers to their questions. 20 years ago, when I started speaking in universities, there was a movement, certainly in Britain, called New Atheism. And everyone was saying within a few years, everyone is going to become completely atheistic. And a lot of sociologists have been predicting that. But it hasn't happened. In fact, the opposite has happened in my experience. People are more open to the spiritual questions of life. And I think part of the reason for that potentially is this, that if we embrace a completely atheistic view of life, there is no answer to the question. There is no purpose. And does anyone care? Well, no. The universe is uncaring. And it doesn't care whether you're here or whether you're not. And if we think about that for any length of time, that's quite bleak and empty. But you might also have another question, which is this. Okay, people turn to God or spirituality or religion to try and find meaning and purpose to life. But is that just wishful thinking? Is that just creating an illusion to make life more bearable? Is that just creating your own meaning in life, like everyone else is trying to do? You may have heard of Sigmund Freud. Certainly if you're studying psychology, I'm sure you will have done. Freud famously, although he wasn't the first person to suggest it, talks about religion as being this projection of our human desires into the heavens. He says, if we're fearful about life and about death, we create a being that will fulfill our desires, will allay our fears and meet our needs. And so he says that's all God and religion is. It's just a projection of our desires. It's just wish fulfillment. Now you may have, has anyone heard of that argument before from Freud's? Kind of quite popular. Now, what do we make of that argument? If there's no God, if there's no spiritual dimension to life, then Freud is given as a really good reason why lots of people still believe in God, even though he doesn't exist. Okay? Granted, that's true. But if God does exist, then by the same logic, he's also given us a good reason why some people don't believe in God. Because you can say, like Freud does, the only reason some people believe in God or spirituality is because they want it to be true. But equally, you could say the reason why people don't believe in it is because they don't want it to be true. And there are some atheists who've been honest enough to admit that. Thomas Nagel, professor of philosophy at New York University, says, it's not just that I don't believe in God, I don't want God to exist. I don't want a universe like that. So Freud doesn't actually answer the question, is it true? He just gives us a reason why people might believe it, even if it's not, but an equally good reason why people don't believe it, even if it is. But the one thing he doesn't tell is whether it's true or not. For that, of course, you'd have to actually look at some evidence. One of the things that we're encouraging people to do this week is to take away some evidence for themselves. On the table outside, there's a whole load of books. Among other things, and far better than my book, is this book, and a few others a bit like it, which are some biographical accounts of the life of Jesus. And as a believer in Jesus, I want to say the greatest evidence for the existence of God for a spiritual dimension in life is the claim, the Christian claim, that God himself revealed himself in human history. And so we'd love you to take those away and check those out. Because what we're saying this week is not just wish fulfillment, it's based on some objective evidence. Now, you may want to ask questions about that later. Go to the Slido and we can look at some of the questions about it. But what I'd like us to do is just look at one section from one of these biographical accounts of Jesus' life and look at what Jesus himself said about this question of purpose, meaning, and value. If you want to read it later, it's in Luke's account of Jesus' life, chapter 12. I'll just read it out to you, and then we'll look at it for a couple of minutes. Then Jesus said to his disciples, to his followers, Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They don't sow or reap, or and then they have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds? Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wild flowers grow. They don't labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon, in all of his splendor, was dressed like one of these. That is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire. How much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? So you see what Jesus is saying? He's saying, how valuable are you? And basically he says, you're more valuable than the ravens, the birds, and you're more valuable than the flowers. Now you might say, well, that's a big deal, right? Like I kind of gathered that, right? But two things very interesting. First of all, notice, I find this really interesting. When Jesus says, you're more valuable than the birds, he didn't pick, the most exotic, beautiful bird that is going, okay? Or like a really majestic eagle that's like powerful. He picks ravens, okay? Now, I am not a bird watcher, but I kind of figure that ravens are not the most exciting birds, okay? Like ravens, they're just really common. They're ugly and they sound horrible. I mean, some birds, they have lovely songs, like ravens don't. You ever heard a raven? It goes like this. Like, that's a raven, okay? It looks ugly, it sounds awful. And Jesus says, God, he cares about the ravens, but he cares about you more. And then he says the wildflowers. Now, I actually do quite like gardening. I've got a garden at home. I've got all sorts of flowers that I like to grow. Some of them take a lot of effort, a lot of attention. Little sad fact, when I'm away from home, I worry about my plants. Maybe it's because I don't have children, so I have plants that I worry about instead. But when Jesus talks about plants, he's not talking about some specimen that you grow in like some special garden. He's just talking about the flowers in the fields, the ones that just grow without anyone trying, okay? And he says God even cares about the flowers in the fields, just as like he cares about the raven. How much more, therefore, does he care about you? Here's the argument. It's like so much more, isn't it? Like if he cares about that, of course he cares about you. We are not in an empty universe where no one cares. Jesus says there is a God who cares about you, and he thinks that you're really valuable. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, I'm more valuable than some wildflowers, and I'm more valuable than a raven. Like, that's not exactly encouraging, is it? like, didn't we all realize that already? Well, are we? Here's an interesting question. How much do you think that you're worth? Okay, how valuable do you think you are? I won't get you to answer it, okay? This is a rhetorical question, okay? According to one scientific study, you are worth about 25 shekels, okay? That's a little bit disappointing for a Monday evening, I know. You were probably hoping for at least 50, but 25 shekels. Now, how did they work this out? And they worked this out by basically getting the average human body and working out the constituent chemical parts of a human body, okay? And this is what the average human being is made of. Okay, there is enough iron to make a 15 centimeter nail. There's enough sulfur to cure a dog of fleas, which is very useful. There's enough carbon to make 900 pencils, more useful perhaps. There's enough potassium to fire a toy gun. There's enough fat. Well, I guess this one is relative, isn't it? So in my case, it's probably more than for some of you. But on average, enough fat to make 7 bars of soap. There's enough phosphorus for 2,200 matches. And there's enough water to fill a large tank. And that is what you are. Okay? About 25 shekels worth of chemicals. Now, we all smile at this point because we all know that we are worth more than that. But my question is why? Why do we assume that we are worth more than that? Don't know if you've heard of this guy, Francis Crick. He was the guy who discovered the structure of DNA, along with another guy in the University of Cambridge last century. He was a scientist. Not all scientists are atheists by any stretch of the imagination, but he was a scientist and also an atheist. And he said this: you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells. You're nothing but a load of neurons. Now, actually, I think he was being very consistent with his worldview there. Because if this universe is a closed system with no God, no spiritual dimension, and nothing more, then that is all you are. Nothing but a load of neurons. 25 shekels worth of chemicals. Now, I don't know how consistent Francis Crick was. You know, did he say to his wife on their wedding anniversary, you know, to my darling neurons, my neurons love you very much? But that is the logical outworking of that way of thinking. So why do we assume that that's wrong? Why do we assume that as human beings we have such a thing as human rights? That we are infinitely more valuable than a flower or a bird? And I'd actually want to suggest the reason why we do is because of the revolution that started in our world, caused by the person that we've just been talking about, Jesus Christ. And the revolution that that caused in terms of how we view ourselves and each other as human beings. I don't know if you've heard of this guy, Tom Holland. He's a historian based in the UK. He's not a Christian believer at all. He's a secular historian. But in his book, looking at the developments of Western history, he basically says this: if you want to understand why we got this idea called human rights, why we think that humans have intrinsic value, you can't really understand it without reference to Jesus Christ. He says the revolution that Jesus Christ brought totally changed our view of ourselves as well as of God. And if you want someone from closer to here, Yuval Noah Harari, an Israeli historian and writer who writes some provocative books. In his book, Sapiens, says something very interesting. He's not at all a Christian believer. He would describe himself as an atheist. But he says, if you want to know where we got human rights from, he says we got it from Christianity. Now, he considers Christianity a myth, but he also seems to think that human rights are a good idea. But he admits that it seems to be Jesus that started this revolution. Because if you look through some of those biographies of Jesus' life, you'll see that Jesus, so we'll come on to that in a second, that Jesus had a totally revolutionary view of other human beings. He viewed all people with dignity and value, whatever their religious backgrounds, whatever their ethnic backgrounds, whatever their gender. Jesus seems to treat everyone with equal value, which in that culture at that time would have been so countercultural and would continue to be so in many places in the world today. Jesus treats people as if they have value. People who've morally messed up, Jesus still cares about, treats them with value. He's revolutionary in the way that he treats people. And that revolution has affected history. You might be wondering who this guy was. Put him up too early. This is William Wilberforce, a British politician. Famous, particularly in the UK, for his work in seeking to abolish the African-American slave trades, which had been so horrific and so evil. And he was inspired to do that because of his conviction that Jesus treated people with value and dignity. Martin Luther King, of course, well known for his fight in the civil rights movement against racism, but inspired by his conviction, based upon his belief in Jesus, that all humans have value and dignity and purpose. And perhaps you haven't heard of this guy, Charles Malik, but you will have heard of this, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Charles Malik was one of the key people involved in drafting that document in the first place. And it certainly was his faith in Jesus that massively influenced the way that document was written. You see, the revolution that Jesus started totally changed people's perceptions of themselves. We have value and dignity if we're not alone in the universe. And not only not alone in the universe, but if the God who created us actually bothered to make himself known to us. That's Jesus' message, basically. God cares about us, not just us in general, but you in particular. Now, you may have all sorts of doubts and questions about that, and you can ask them in a minute. But if it's true, that would totally change not only our view of God, but it would change our view of ourselves, wouldn't it? One last thing to say then, in that sense. In answer to the question, does anyone care? The answer is yes. Jesus says, incredibly, there is a God who cares profoundly about us. I guess the question to ask at the end, though, is, do we care about him? Because I guess for a lot of us, it's very easy, isn't it, to go through life without even thinking about God. Perhaps without even thinking about these big questions. And if there is a God responsible not only for the universe, but for us, and if we were to spend our lives not even thinking about him, the consequences of that could be quite serious, Jesus says. And yet, what I also discover in Jesus is this. I discover that God doesn't care about me because I already care about him. Actually, Jesus says that God cares about me even when I couldn't care less about him. That's even greater love, isn't it? So if you read through the story of Jesus, you see that not only does he give value and dignity to everyone, but ultimately the story crescendos, doesn't it? With not only him giving value to people, but him literally giving his life for people. Giving his life for people who at that stage and at that point couldn't care less. But he cared for them. And actually, as you see that demonstration of how much God cares about you, that kind of makes you think, well, if God was like that, maybe I would want to care more about a God who cared for me at that degree and to that level. Now, listen, we want to have some time for questions, so I'm not going to say any more now, other than to say we would love to know what you think about these things. I think if you scan this QR code, I think I'm right in saying you will get to a feedback form. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, great. I don't know what it says because I haven't scanned it yet. I haven't got any Wi-Fi. But if you scan it, you can get to a feedback form and you can tell us, I think, what you think of the event and how to keep in touch. So I'll put that up now because we would love to know your feedback, but also love to keep in touch and connect with you. Because it might be you're here tonight and you're saying, well, actually, I'm really skeptical about some of these claims, particularly these claims about the historic nature of Jesus and so on. And if you are in that category, we'd love to connect. We'd love to help you investigate. And as I said, there are some copies of a biography of Jesus' life, different languages out on the table. We'd love to give one to you. Check it out. At the very least, you'll end up a better informed skeptic after reading it than you are now. So do take that away. Or if you want to read a book written by myself, there's another one called Making Sense of Life, which deals with a number of these big questions of life to help yourself later. But it might also be that you'd really want to find out more. You're not potentially skeptical, you're more intrigued. And if that is you, then of course we'd especially like to connect and tell you about stuff that might be really helpful for you after these events are finished. So the QR code will take you to that. But if we go back, we'll leave the Slido up so you can put that in, but I'll hand back to our hosts. Okay?
Thank you very much, Michael. Great. Well, I can get the Slido up straight away. So if you've never used Slido before, then it's very simple. You can scan this code. And hopefully, as you write down questions, they'll start appearing. Wow, here we go. And we'll also be accepting questions from the floor as well. So if you're comfortable raising a hand, you're very welcome to do that. But, well, I mean, I guess, Michael, let's get straight into it. We've got a question already. So do, as we go through, then keep writing your questions, keep voting. We won't probably have time to get through all the questions. So if you're voting for the questions, we'll make sure that the questions that everyone is asking will get answered.
Feel free to write them.
Yes.
Yes, great.
All languages welcome. We might need some help, but yeah.
Within limits, right?
Yeah.
Swahili?
Yes, everything.
Yeah.
So, well, that's
Great.
Here we are, Michael.
Okay. Just to say, please feel free to ask any questions you like, and I won't be offended if you completely disagree with what I've just said. I'd be more offended if you didn't say anything. I'd much rather hear your thinking. Okay, so totally go for that. Well, this has already got 5 votes, and it is also the only one so far. So we'll start with this one. In a world so filled with hatred and prejudice, how can one be convinced that they have purpose? That's a huge question, isn't it? That raises all sorts of other questions that you might want to come back on in a second. It can seem really hard in the utter chaos of our world to think that life has purpose. One atheist philosopher in the UK said, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people get lucky, some people get hurt, and we won't find any reason to it, nor any justice. He went on, DNA neither knows nor cares, it just is, and we dance to its music. In other words, there is no purpose, this world is just chaotic. I guess my question back, though, is even talking about hatred and prejudice assumes a kind of moral value, right? When we talk about hatred and prejudice, it assumes that these things are bad, that we don't want them. But why? If we are just a result of an accidental collocation of atoms, as one person put it, where did we get the idea that things should be a certain way, or ought not to be a certain way? There was a Scottish philosopher called David Hume, and he says, you cannot get an ought from an is. In other words, if you've only got a physical world and atoms in motion, saying that the world should be a certain way or shouldn't be a certain way becomes meaningless. It's just the way it is. So I would suggest that even our reaction against the injustices and the prejudices of our world is, in a sense, an indicator that life was created with purpose, although, of course, it is not a guarantee that we will always experience it in that way. C.S. Lewis, the Oxford writer and thinker, said, the only way we know whether a line is crooked is if we have a straight line to compare it to. So actually, when we complain about the injustices of this world, it kind of assumes that we were made for more than that. And the answer to that question is absolutely yes. And so according to the Bible view of the world, you're right to feel a sense of anger at injustice and prejudice, because this isn't the way our world is meant to be. And our very intuition, therefore, points towards the fact that we were created for something bigger and better than that. Now, there's all sorts of other questions you might want to ask about purpose and suffering, but we'll come to that in a bit. Great, okay? Wow. Before we go to any more, anyone want to come back on that or question? I said that we could put hands up as well, so do feel free to put your hand up at any time. Otherwise, we'll just keep going on the screen. Okay. Okay, Papa used the iPad as his shopping board and he was completely satisfied with that. Why can't that be enough? Just like everyone around might as well. Okay, that's a really interesting question. So, Grandad's happy. He's got a new shopping board. Like, what is wrong with that? Is there a problem with that? Firstly, I guess you could say, well, on one level, he's missing out. Like, there is so much more he could have used that chopping board for. And so, although he is happy, could he have been even more happy? Or actually, perhaps understanding how horrific technology is for our mental well-being, perhaps he was happier with the chopping board. But, you know, again, to quote one thinker, he said, you know, our problem in the West, he said, is that actually we're often too easily pleased. In other words, what if we were made for more, and our biggest problem is we're satisfied with too little? So that's one part of it. I guess the other thing is, obviously there is a slight difference between an iPad and a human being. We aren't ultimately just technology. According to the biblical understanding of human beings, we're created in the image of God, and we're created to have relationship with God. And so actually living life in independence from God is less like grandpa not using his iPad correctly. It's more like a spouse walking out on their lover. Now, we're free to do it because love involves choice, but it also would be a tragedy, wouldn't it? If God were to be the source of life and love and everything else, and we were to live without him and disconnection from him, would that be a mistake? So I think at least on a couple levels. There's something else. You know, when you have a thought that comes to your mind, it might come back to me later, but we'll keep going. Okay, how do I know that I fulfilled the right purposes? Yeah, so again, to use the iPad illustration, what is the correct use? Well, I guess it partly depends whether you think that life was created with purpose. Of course, if you take the kind of secular atheistic assumption about life, because I didn't have a creator or no one thought of me into being, then ultimately I don't have a purpose. But if I was created, you'd have to ask the question, well, for what reason? You know, you're sitting on a chair. That chair was created for a reason. The iPad was created for a reason, and so on. Certainly, according to the Bible story, we were created for a reason. And actually, the reason the Bible gives is love. It's that we might experience God's love and that we might reflect that, not only back to God, but also to each other. Because the Bible fundamentally says that God is love. And therefore, we find our meaning and our purpose in connection with and receiving the source of love from him. And so I would say, in a kind of big picture, what is my purpose in life? It is to love and to be loved by the God who made me. But in particular, what does that mean? Well, in one sense, there's a whole lot more to that question, isn't there? Because although in one sense we are all created with equal value and dignity, we are all created quite differently. We have different abilities and skills and passions and interests and desires and so on. And so what does it look like for me to love God and to be loved by God and to love others? Well, that will probably look different than it will for you or for someone else. And that partly comes from discovering yourself as well as discovering who God is. Yes, God has made me a human being with infinite value, but he's also made me a unique human being with unique abilities, skills, and gifts. And so therefore my question is to work out, well, what does it look like to express that? That's part of the adventure and the excitement and the joy of life. Asking that question, but asking it with a bigger picture in mind, which is, these are not gifts and abilities that I've just accidentally inherited, but maybe they're here for a purpose, and that in using them for the good of others, that is part of a bigger purpose as well. That's a great question. So thank you for that one. Anyone want to come back on any of those before we keep going? No. There are 7+ billion people in the world. There are millions of stars in the universe. It's hard to believe we matter when we're so small. Do you agree? Yes. Yes, I do. In fact, in the Old Testament book of Psalms, there's a beautiful song in the Bible that says, addressing God, says, "When I consider the heavens, the work of your hands, what is mankind that you're mindful of him?" And I can imagine, the guy writing that song. He must have been out on a starlit night, looking up at the heavens. And of course, he wouldn't have known, 3,000 years ago what we know now, which is he was looking up at probably 100 billion stars and 100 billion galaxies and so on. And who was he? Well, not one of 7 billion, but still a lot of other people in the world. We are so infinitesimally small, aren't we? And yet, none of us genuinely lives as if that was the case. Like, I would say none of us consistently live that view of life out. We all can't help but feel that our lives have some kind of meaning. I guess the question is why? Are we all just being utterly irrational and inconsistent? And should we just suck it up and figure that we're completely pointless and we're a bit of cosmic stardust that will soon be disappearing? Or do those emotions and desires come from something real? And do they point to something real? And if you read that song in the Bible, it goes on to say that actually they are connected to something real. We're created with value and significance. And that's a beautiful story. Our value doesn't come from our size, it comes from something else, which is also really good because if you think about it, we talk about human equality, but clearly in one sense, we are not all the same. Some people have greater intellectual abilities than others. Some people have greater sporting abilities than others. Some people, sadly, are severely limited in their abilities for no fault of their own, and so on. And yet we all kind of think, don't we, that we have equal value. And the Bible story says there's a reason behind that, and that is our value doesn't come from being the biggest. It comes from being connected to the God who started the whole show. And that gives us a basis outside of ourselves for value. Okay, happy to keep going? Great.
Yeah, we could take
How many more?
a couple more questions.
Okay.
We'll aim to wrap up around 15:15.
Great.
So,
Before we go, anyone more from the floor before we go to any more from here? No, you all like the anonymity of Slido, I see. So this is fine. Okay, I'm just taking these down from the top. So before Jesus, how do people know their value and purpose? And did Jesus change that after he came? It's a really good question. Was it that basically, for however many 1,000 years of human history, basically everyone thought they were completely valueless. Along came Jesus, and suddenly it's like, oh, now we have value. Well, in one sense, whether or not you believe in Jesus, I would say, as someone who follows Jesus, that God himself has put on our conscience and our hearts some awareness of him. So even if we don't know and believe in Jesus, there is a sense in our humanness of our value and significance. And part of us can't help but sense that. But also, if you take the whole Bible story as a whole, right back at the beginning of the very first book, Genesis, we have the description of God's creation of the universe. And it says something about God's creation of human beings that is different to anything else that God creates. And that is, of human beings, it says that God created them in his image. The imago Dei, as we call it. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that God looks like us? No. But it is saying that something of what God is like is reflected in his creation of us in a way that it isn't reflected in the rest of creation. And therefore we have a dignity and value and significance that is given to us by nature of that. And I think a big part of that is being created in the image of a God who is love. We were created to reflect and to know that love and to show that love to others. So right back at the beginning of the Bible, we have that idea that humans are created in God's image. And then you have lots of laws that talk about how that should be lived out. Now, the fact is that through human history, we have often failed to live as if that was true. And even today, that is the case, isn't it? And so often our sadnesses come from the fact that we are treated as less than valuable. One of the things I find so remarkable about Jesus is that Jesus consistently lives out that conviction in a way that is utterly consistent and in a way that I don't think any other human being has. And so if you want to see what it looks like to treat people with value and dignity, then look at the life of Jesus. He doesn't just teach that you should do that, he practices it. And even as he's being crucified, he continues to love and forgive the people who are crucifying him. So I would say the idea was there before, but it comes into such clear focus, not just as an idea, but exemplified in Jesus' life, which is why I would say, check out the biographies of Jesus for yourself. If you're not convinced, just say, if this is true, what do I make of not the Jesus of, religious portrayal, but the Jesus of the first century from the eyewitness biographies. Okay. One more question?
I think yes. But lots of votes on this question.
Okay. We'll see how we go. We've got a quarter past, you say. So, as believers, how can we deal with suicide, suicidal thoughts when we're supposed to be completely clear about having a purpose by being children of God? Yeah, thank you for that question. Often there can be a sense for people who do believe in God, an even greater sense perhaps of guilt, which is, I know that I should feel valuable. I know objectively that the Bible says that God loves me, but I really don't feel that. And if you have ever had suicidal thoughts, and you are a believer in God, believer in Jesus, and you're not alone. Actually, a very good friend of mine who I've really learned a lot from, who's been a great mentor to me, has been very honest about his own struggles in that way. And that is because we live in a world where we are created with value and dignity, but we also, according to the Bible story, live in a world that is broken in every single way. And we see that brokenness evidenced, but that brokenness is also experienced not just physically, we have bodies that get sick, ultimately will die, but also psychologically. And so just as being a follower of Jesus doesn't mean that I never get sick physically, being a follower of Jesus doesn't mean that I won't struggle mentally. I live in a broken world with broken bodies and broken minds and so on. So being a follower of Jesus does not guarantee that we won't struggle with mental illness, or we wouldn't struggle with suicidal thoughts. I would, though, suggest that it does give us an objective reality to challenge our own thinking by. I was just chatting to someone before the talk started, and they said, what advice would you give to someone who started following Jesus? And I said, well, one of the pieces of advice that I was given when I was a very young Christian myself, when I started following Jesus, was that there are three things that are important. They said there's faith, there's facts, and there's feelings. They said some people get everything in the wrong order. They said they start with their feelings. They say, well, if I feel it, then I will believe it, then I'll have faith. And then I won't really worry about the facts. They'll just, I'll leave them for someone else to worry about. But the trouble is our feelings do go up and down. Even, for those of us that haven't necessarily experienced suicidal thoughts, we will all go through periods in life where our emotions seem out of step with reality. And the question then is, if I'm basing my beliefs on my feelings, that's a very unstable foundation. So they said, no, do it the other way. Start with the facts. Did Jesus live? Did he die? Did he rise again? Is it true? Check it out. And the more I did, the more convinced I was that it was true. Then he said, okay, then go to your faith. He said, faith is not an act of your feelings, it's an act of your will. Am I going to believe that when Jesus said, I am valuable, that he loves me, and so on, am I going to believe that that is true? Yes. Might not feel it, but I'm still going to believe it. And then, he said, when you start with the facts, put your faith in what's true, then your feelings can follow along. And sometimes we can challenge our feelings by the facts. And so I've found that often I've had to do that myself in different times in life. It's one of the reasons why I love reading the Bible, love reading the words of Jesus, because it challenges my feelings with objective reality. And sometimes, even as I read it, I find that my feelings start to change in line with the reality I'm reading about. Which, maybe just say this to finish, is such a more wonderful way to live. Often when I chat to friends who don't have any beliefs, and certainly don't believe in God, it doesn't mean that they go around kind of suicidal all the time, but often they cannot think too deeply about life, because if they did, they probably would. Because, if I thought deeply about the fact that life has come from nothing, going nowhere, and has no point, so we can only cope with life by not thinking too much about it. Whereas I want to say, as a follower of Jesus, the way I cope with life is not by not thinking about it, but by actually thinking more deeply about it. Because actually I've got a foundation that I can hold on to in the midst of all the other turmoil of life. I see there are other questions that look really good, which we haven't got time to look at now. If they're your questions and I didn't get to answer them, I'm going to be probably out there where the food is in a couple of minutes. So do come and talk to me. If also my answers to your earlier questions have created other questions, which often happens, I find, then of course come and ask that as well. Or of course chat to the other people around. Some people have got these lovely black t-shirts on saying The Search. If you search for them, then these guys would also be really happy to chat and answer any questions that you still have. Okay, thank you.
Wow.
So we're done for today. We also have talks with Michael tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. We would love to see you all, and we would love you to invite your friends or anyone that you think might be interested. We also have groups that meet weekly in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. So you can approach us, me, Josh, or the people wearing the t-shirt. We will point you in the right direction. For now, we can, hang out together, eat some food, and don't forget to take some books from us.
And just to say, the building is going to get locked at 8:30. That's why we've had to rush at the end here. So there's nothing stopping us from hanging out outside the building. But do grab any food and drinks, and then we can just hang out together outside.
Great.
Yeah.
Josh, because we're doing house where it will be tomorrow.
And tomorrow's events are going to be in the engineering building, which is just the other side of the grass that way.
Thank you, Michael.
All right. Thank you.
By your permission.
Thank you, Zoom people.
Yeah, go for it.